Hi, I'm Terry Burns. Welcome back to my class on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of John Dee. This is my second class on the theorems. If you're just jumping in the middle here, you may want to start back at the beginning. I've got a link of that below, including a very thorough discussion of his letter to Maximillian, which is often not translated. I'm teaching this class from this book. This is the translation that Dr. Nancy Turner and I did that was published in 2021 from Ouroboros Press, but I will also give you the links and all the material you need to understand just in these videos. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we will get going here. So I already have had one class on the theorems where we went through the first three and I gave you some context of the theorems. Please watch at least that video and the one on context if you watch nothing else, or you'll be kind of jumping in cold here. I am going to do a little review though, just so you know if you know the things you should know to continue. All right, when Dee introduces these theorems, and here he is, John Dee. And if you're jumping in at this point, you should know what the Monas Hieroglyphica is, written in 1564, and who John Dee is. If you don't, you want to start back at the beginning. But here at the theorems, after the letter to Maximillian, a very long letter, after the letter to Printer Silvius, a shorter letter, we have Dee tell you that he is going to explain his monad glyph, which you have also seen now many times, mathematically, magically, kabbalistically, and anagogically. And you know what those things are. You know what anagogic is. You know what Kabbalistic is. You know what magic means in terms of D, which, yes, means all those kind of Agrippan correspondences. It also, in Dee's world, overlaps totally with his ideas of alchemy and mathematically according to number and shape. Okay, so test yourself on those ideas. That's how he says he's going to explain it. You got that, right? Okay, then in an earlier class, I talked about the problem of poor translation, not to pick on people who came before me. It's just like Dr. Turner and I had an advantage in looking at other translations, not just in English, but also in German and French. And one of the problems that jumps out is when people say they don't understand or you cannot explain the hieroglyphic monad, it's because they're working with poor translations by people who also didn't understand it. So I gave the lengthy example of Genesis, since this is a cosmogenic text. Cosmogenic, part of that word comes from the biblical Genesis. You must understand the allusions to Genesis. And I was mildly entertained and actually quite saddened that these first English translations literally leave out God's light. So if you're looking at the cosmogenic text where light pierces creation, whether you're looking at it in terms of the tree of life, you're looking at it in terms of Genesis, or you're looking at it in terms of Plato's Timaeus and the first forms being perfect geometric forms. Any way you look at it, it's a problem if you have a translation that leaves out God's light. So we talked about that. Also, more comparisons of different translations are at this link. This is part of an article that Dr. Turner and I did back in 2007. And also early translations of those first 17 theorems are online there. But let's review the first three theorems now. So, theorem one, by virtue of the straight line in the circle, the first and most simple manifestation of all things, non-existent or merely hidden in the veils of nature, is produced in light. Okay, quiz yourself. I don't mean this to be one of these lectures where, you know, you can just nod and yeah, I kind of get it. Quiz yourself and see if you understand the context here. How is the context here the fiat lux of Genesis 1:3? That's going to be super important when we get to, say, Theorem 17, which is all about light and conic sections. I have this little picture here to remind you that every transformation should be, you should be able to do it in 2D using a compass and straight edge. And then you should be able to flip it to higher dimensions, like a sphere, a circle to a sphere, and also flip it around on its axis. We went through the first two theorems after that also. since we went through them at that time, I'm not going to reread them here, but some things you should have in mind. What, why does D pun so much on line? In that first theorem, his Latin word for line was lineam recta. After that, he just is saying recta, recta, recta. And we talked a little about the multiple meanings it can have, even in Platonic thought. We talked about how this echoes the first book of Euclid's geometry, and Dee wrote the introduction to the first English translation of Euclid, which was done by Billingsley in 1567. We talked about what he means again by a monad and why he says monad here and punctum in the next one for a point. Okay, and then we talked about why he tells you that the sun and moon and other planets revolve around the earth, that it's geocentric in a certain sense, but not the way many critics have taken it. It's geocentric in the way that a modern astrologer doing your chart would put you in the center and you're on earth. So every force that affects you goes around you. And we will see in later theorems how he shifts at times to have heliocentrism as a frame of reference, and other times something very different than either. That brings us to theorem 4. Okay, so let's read this and then talk about what he's doing here. D says, although the half circle of the moon appears here to be above the solar circle, and so to speak, nearly superior and first, the moon nevertheless regards the sun as her lord and king. All right, superior can just mean above, right? And so here, oops, this is above. It can mean, but doesn't have to mean better than. So what is going on? And since I already clicked on these, you can see that I'm reminding you of the context of the Emerald Tablet. There's no original left, but pick your favorite translation. You have the as above, so below. What is above is like what is below to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. And the sun is that one thing, that monad's father, and the moon is its mother. Okay, this is hermetic sacred geometry. D calls this monad glyph, which is his symbol of everything, his hermetic seal, a magical seal. So this moon is a she because she's the mother. The sun, her lord and king, is the father, and they are animated. Well, first of all, in Plato's Timaeus, all living things are animated. It's an animated universe. And she is seen to so rejoice in his shape and in being near him that she emulates the magnitude of his radius. Well, if you continued this circle around, it would seem that this radius of the sun would be the same as this radius of the moon, as it appears to the common man. We might better substitute uneducated man here. D has, as I've mentioned, sort of an issue with common people. That makes me quite delight that has a common female, I can explain this this text to you. But it's the idea that to someone who is uneducated, they look up at the sky, they see the moon at a full moon. It's like, wow, that's the same size as the sun. Sometimes it's bigger if it's a supermoon, sometimes less, but it appears, if you're not that precise and not that educated, like, wow, the moon is the same as the sun. But you know from your elementary school science classes that no, the moon is much closer to us. That's why it looks larger. We have a lot better concept of optical perspective than people did in Dee's time, but still, most educated astrologers knew that the moon reflects the light of the sun and the moon is closer than the sun. In fact, he has a bunch of theorems in his other work, the Propoitomata Aphoristica, where he's demonstrating this. And demonstrating like this is why the moon appears to get smaller and larger. So that's what he's talking about here. She always turns her light towards the same. We always see the same face of the moon reflecting the light of the sun. And in this matter, so much does she long to be at last imbued with solar rays that when she has been, as it were, transformed into him, she disappears from the sky. Now this will happen, this will have two different meanings. One is an eclipse. That is, if you have a lunar eclipse, the moon covers the sun, but the other is at a new moon. The moon gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, disappears, and then you have a new moon. So then she appears again, horn-shaped, exactly as we have depicted her. We'll come back to horn-shaped in a second. I want to talk about this notion here. The moon as something that appears like the same size as the sun, but which an educated person knows has to be closer and therefore larger, is also something you see in various ideas of geocentric planetary order. I'm not really interested in them, so I'm not going to talk about them. What I am going to talk about is that, remember, D will have a veiled heliocentrism. And by the way, so will many, many educated humanists of that time. It's simply not safe to put in writing. Think again of what happened to Galileo generations later, a couple generations later. The other thing, though, is if we think of the sun as superior, D is going to be using what is called the Kircher Tree of Life. That's the one commonly used today in Hermetic Kabbalah. And it is called the Kircher Tree because the first place people think they find it is with Athanasius Kircher a century after D. But Kircher just ripped stuff off right and left from D, which I'll have a separate video on in a week or so, actually. But you can reverse engineer that probably Kircher is getting his tree from D. So if you just use that tree of life that is familiar in Hermetic Kabbalah, which I showed you in the context video, you're fine. And in that, the sun, this, is associated with Tiferet, and it is above Yesod, associated with the moon, which is receiving the light from Tiferet. So it will work when we go through these first 10 again as how they work with different Sephiroth on the tree of life. Also, it works in terms of Agrippin and common metallic correspondences in physical alchemy. That is, gold is superior, more valuable than silver, gold being associated with the sun and Tiferet, silver to the moon and Yesod. Something else here is that D is going to be adding in measures of time. In an ideal world to D, time measures and geometric measures, spatial measures, become the same. So why would a year be superior to a month? Well, a one solar year, 365 days, is bigger, like the sun is bigger. A month is about, the moon rotates in about a month, 28 days. So that's a shorter time period. Now, D knew this stuff really, really well. He spent a lot of time arguing for an improved calendar because in the time that he wrote this, 1564, people in England and in Europe knew that something was off with the calendar. When you get to the first day of spring, the first day of Aries, that's his little sign down there, as we'll talk about later, it wasn't the first day of spring. Farmers knew the calendar was off. Winter wasn't falling when it should be falling. And so D argued to have a new calendar accepted. Now, England didn't actually do that till 1752, although European countries did in 1582. Okay, I said I was going to come back to horn-shaped. That word in Latin that means horn-shaped also means the new moon. So there's another reason why he's drawing the moon as horns on his little stylized Mercury glyph here. Okay, theorem 5. D says, and certainly by guiding the lunar half circle, again, that's this, to the solar complement, that's this, one day is made out of morning and evening. Thus, this would be when the first light of the philosophers was made. Okay, remember again the context of the emerald tablet that I've talked about. So the sun and moon give birth in the emerald tablet to this one thing. But what about our other contexts? Well, they're going to be huge for this fifth theorem. And finally, we're going to see some reason for why he is talking about certain things and associating them with certain numbers. Here, Genesis 5 is going to be very important. So let me just go through quickly. Dee would have read the Bible actually in ancient Greek since he was an expert, but also the Latin Vulgate. So I'm giving it to you in Latin, and then I'm giving you an English translation. Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and the earth in Genesis 2 was void and empty, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the waters. These, in Neoplatonic thought, are waters much more like the element water for Aristotelian elements and for causes and for qualities, stuff we'll talk about later on. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. That's the reference to light in the first theorem. And God saw that the light was good, and so divided the light from the darkness. We think about all of those divisions and boundaries of light we talked about in the letter to Maximillian. More on that in just a second. And now Genesis 5. The light was called day, and the darkness night, and there was evening and morning one day. This is the first light of the philosophers that he's talking about, the light that leads to the philosopher's stone, the light that flashes down the tree of light, the light that in the Timaeus punctures into creation and creates perfect geometric forms, and then everything else that comes out from that. And now you can also connect this to some of the ideas, some of the context in Neoplatonic thought and Kabbalistic thought set up in the letter from Maximillian, like the ideas about light, shade, and boundary. These are mainly from Plato's Republics, book 5 and 6. That's where the allegory of the cave is, for example. And then the second tree of life, the Qliphothic tree of life, that's made of shades rather than emanations of God. So all of these contexts he puts into these few little words. He says this is a rare text, right? And by rare, he means succinct, but not succinct and easily understandable. It's succinct and packed with multiple layers of meaning. Okay, so next time I'm going to go on to Theorem 6. You might want to either take a screenshot or write down these terms and make sure you know them. I'll define them then too, but ternary, quaternary, septenary, and octad, and we're going to contemplate what those relate to in terms of sacred geometry. We'll briefly look at how they relate to something on the tree of life, although we won't be looking at all 10 theorems together, the first 10, and in terms of how they relate to the 10 Sephiroth, until we get all the way to 10. Okay, that's it for today, though. Thanks for joining me, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.